Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Snippit Sports Science. Last week we started to review the paper of hypoxia and resistance training, looking at localized versus systemic responses. We started off with introducing the concept of BFR, or blood flow restriction training, and we really just delved into the basics of the morphological adaptations, the increases in strength, and also the perceptual responses. So today we're going to move on and look at the potential mechanisms of BFR for hypertrophy and strength. So the first concept is just get an understanding of the concentration of metabolites.
Right, so this is a lot of the basis of what we talk about when we're discussing metabolic stress versus mechanical stress. With blood flow restriction training, typically what we do is we remove some of that mechanical stress and we're replacing it with additional metabolic stress. When we're exercising, the energy that we're using is a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's used to be actually contracting the muscle fibers. As ATP is used up, it gets broken into two pieces, ADP and inorganic phosphate. One of the phosphates breaks off ATP and forms ADP. So we can look at that breakage of the inorganic phosphate and we can see that as a little bit of how much metabolic stress was occurring in the muscle. After that breakage, in order to make more ATP for the muscle to continue contracting, we use a molecule called phosphocreatine. This is a lot of the reason that we supplement creatine, so that we can be making more phosphocreatine. So phosphocreatine comes in and very rapidly donates one of those phosphate groups back to an ADP to create more ATP. As ATP is hydrolyzed or broken up during the muscle contraction, it also produces a lot of acid, hydrogen ion. We see this as a low pH. So when you see a low pH, what that means is high hydrogen ion, high acid. It's a lot of what the burn sensation comes from exercise and why we associate that burn sensation with greater metabolic stress and thus greater adaptation. With those, when we're doing anaerobic exercise, so in a hypoxic environment where there's a limited amount of oxygen, we'll be required to be doing more anaerobic exercise as opposed to aerobic exercise. And so we're largely going to be using glucose as our substrate, just plain sugar. As glucose is used to create more energy for the muscle cell, it creates a byproduct called lactate, not lactic acid. There's both lactate and acid, but physiologically, there's essentially no lactic acid. But we do use lactate as another marker of how much metabolic stress has occurred in the muscle. So what we see are that all four of these, the phosphocreatine depletion, the increased inorganic phosphate, the increased lactate production, and decreased pH, or increased hydrogen ion, are all responses that occur to blood flow restriction training. So we're seeing that there is greater metabolic stress in blood flow restriction training.
A study to really highlight nicely what Jared has just been talking about was that they showed that increases in muscle cross-sectional area following BFR training has been strongly correlated to metabolic stress. And this was measured by increases in inorganic phosphate and also decreases in pH. So taken together, these findings suggest that the decreased availability of O2 to the working muscles during BFR increases the reliance on anaerobic metabolism and restricts lactate clearance. So this metabolic response to resistance exercise with BFR therefore may potentially lead to greater type 2 muscle fiber recruitment and the hormonal responses, intramuscular signaling and intracellular swelling, as we know other effects of BFR have been shown to elicit.
So moving into hormonal responses, Chris, you're the expert in this.
Well, there's a lot of experts out there, to be honest, but the thing that we need to realise here that hormones play an integral role in regulating the anabolic response to resistance exercise. Earlier work by Christian Cook and Chris Bevan in rugby union players showed that the hormonal response to resistance exercise is actually protocol specific. So traditionally we've thought that hypertrophy type protocols, 12 reps, elicit the greater responses and hence you got the increases in size and strength. But it's actually the protocol that's more specific to the athlete and possibly the fiber type. However, talking about BFR specifically, there's lots of papers out there showing that elevation in concentration of hormones such as growth hormone, insulin growth factor 1, and testosterone. And these also increase the likelihood of hormone receptor interactions that promote the anabolic processes.
And some of those hormone responses have actually been quite extraordinary. We've seen as much as 290 times greater growth hormone response to blood flow restriction training compared to a control group. And that growth hormone response might even be greater than traditional resistance exercise.
The growth hormone response to low intensity resistance exercise appears to provide a significant anabolic stimulus, which we normally wouldn't even see with some traditional exercise protocols. Another marker that we both quite enjoy working with is testosterone concentrations, and that's actually been shown traditionally to correlate quite strongly with strength, speed and power. But it's actually another marker of behaviours or psychological behaviours, which I think is really important to highlight here. So concepts such as aggression, motivation to train, and in one study it was actually correlated strongly to loads increased by the athlete.
Self-selected load. The athlete chose to lift harder.
Yeah. So take this concept, for example, when you go into a gym and it's pumping, the music's good, it's a really good vibe, and you really get in the moment, you start putting more weight on, and that's pretty much what we're talking about here. You just end up having a really good session, and what happens is that if you're able to produce this session after session, the longitudinal adaptive responses of the body, that's where you're going to get the improvements in strength and therefore in performance parameters such as power, strength and speed.
Yeah. Also with that insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, although there might not be as much of an acute response with blood flow restriction training, it's been observed that the IGF-1 response to exercise typically occurs 16 to 28 hours following the growth hormone release. So you need to be exercising, have the growth hormone release, and then have the IGF-1 pop up afterwards. So it's a bit hard to catch with research design. They have found with high frequency training, with blood flow restriction training, so if you're going twice a day with blood flow restriction training, which you can because you can go at a low intensity, you might be able to chronically elevate your growth hormone levels and concurrent increases in IGF-1.
So the actions of growth hormone and testosterone are enhanced by catecholamines, which also reflect the acute demands of exercise and influence force production, muscle contraction rate, and also energy availability.
Yeah, these are the typical stress hormones that, like acute phase stress hormones that people talk about a lot: adrenaline, noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what we've seen is that norepinephrine does increase in response to blood flow restriction training.
So therefore, they seem to think that there's likely that a combination of anaerobic factors such as local ischemia and accumulation of lactate and hydrogen ions may stimulate peripheral afferent neural activity, resulting in an enhanced growth hormone releasing hormone secretion and or inhibition of somatostatin.
Nailed it.
Release from the hypothalamus. Had a little bit of trouble with that one, listeners.
So quite a word, somatostatin. Soma is a root meaning body, and statin, like stasis, is to stay the same. So somatostatin, the hormone, causes your body to stay the same, to simplify that. And so inhibiting that allows for growth.
So in general, low-intensity resistance exercise combined with BFR promotes a favourable anabolic endocrine response, similar to that of traditional training programs designed to promote hypertrophy. However, while growth hormone appears to be the primary hormone affected by BFR, the direct influence of growth hormone on strength gains remains equivocal.
So that argument has really largely come against the idea that the small transient increases from exercise don't create enough of a hormonal response to be causing adaptations. But small relative to what is my first question, because exercise is one of the greatest stimuli that you can give the human body. So if you look at all the interventions that change that hormone, how large is exercise compared to anything else? It might be one of the largest things to change a particular hormone. And secondly, if we think about those transient increases, what we found, for example, with twice daily blood flow restriction training, is that you can actually chronically elevate your growth hormone levels. So it's not a transient increase after the exercise in that growth hormone increase. You can actually, if you continue to train twice daily with blood flow restriction training, you can potentially chronically elevate your growth hormone levels and be getting those subsequent IGF, insulin-like growth factor 1 responses from that.
And focusing on back to testosterone, if we think about this using the words of Christian Cook, testosterone is the molecule of the mind. So if we're able to improve testosterone, improve our motivation and our behaviours, which are favourable towards improvements during exercise sessions, which increase the stress or the mechanical stress and the loads on our body, these adaptive responses are the responses we need to get stronger. However you do that, or whichever mark you look at, it shows that there is some sort of benefit. And I think we need to look and start to realise that rather than getting bogged down in the science of it all, that there is something there for BFR of users out there.
Exactly. A lot of researchers have previously looked at testosterone as an anabolic hormone by looking at its effect on receptors that affect muscle protein synthesis and breakdown. And what we've become interested in recently are the effects of testosterone on the amygdala and the frontal lobe of the brain. So affecting the amygdala to cause emotional responses and the frontal lobe to be causing decision responses. And on the back of that, we can have more emotional and rational decisions to be training harder.
So the next concept that we want to delve into is around the intramuscular signaling through the use of BFR on resistance training.
All right, so this is one of the mechanisms for resistance training adaptation that a lot of people have focused on being one of the most important. What we're looking at here are certain molecules that are actually signaling molecules that tell the muscle to grow. And the important ones here are mammalian target of rapamycin, mTOR, as sort of our master regulatory signaling molecule there, as well as ribosomal S6 kinase 1, which is a downstream regulator of mTOR. What we found with these is that both mTOR and S6K1 are both enhanced by blood flow restriction training. Similarly, when we look at reactive oxygen species, although a lot of people consider oxidation to be harmful, we have found that reactive oxygen species are essential for cellular function and development, and that they may play a role in adaptation to exercise. Similarly, there is also myostatin, similar to somatostatin. So whereas somatostatin was stasis of the body, myostatin is stasis of the muscle. Similarly, you don't want your muscle to be staying the same, you want it to be growing. And what we found is that myostatin has decreased expression in response to blood flow restriction training.
So it's a negative regulator of skeletal muscle growth.
Exactly. All right, moving into intracellular swelling, or as I prefer to call it, the pump.
And this is possibly the one thing that a lot of athletes who have lower limb injuries using BFR quite enjoy. The knee's a great example. They're doing single leg squats, they have joint pain, they put it on, they achieve the pump, they feel the activation, and they actually have some sort of satisfaction from the session. So really this is that novel mechanism that has been proposed by numerous authors to mediate anabolic responses to resistance training with BFR. So it heavily relies on anaerobic metabolism due to osmotic changes caused by lactate accumulation. Earlier, Jared spoke about the role of lactate release and how that actually assists with improvements in strength and hypertrophy. But it's the localized hypoxic environment created by the BFR which increases the production of metabolites, while the occlusion itself limits the venous outflow, which promotes further metabolite accumulation. Therefore, the resultant increase in the flow of water into the cell is required to equilibrate the osmotic gradient.
Right, so what we're seeing is these metabolites get accumulated. As the metabolites accumulate, they pull more water into the cell. And as water gets pulled into the muscle cell, it gets too stretched. It gets just absolutely filled with water and stretched out to a large size.
So this swelling increases the protein synthesis and decreases proteolysis and hepatocytes, osteocytes, and muscle fibers.
And it's the muscle fibers we care about.
Exactly right. So with respect to the muscle, it's proposed that the cell swelling may trigger the proliferation of satellite cells and facilitate their fusion to hypertrophy the muscle fibers. Once again, what we really care about.
Right. So what we're seeing is as the muscle cell gets stretched out, it experiences a threat to the cellular integrity, and on the back of that there may be a response to improve the cellular integrity by reinforcing the ultrastructure of that cell.
Going back again, that this increase in the muscle cell volume could possibly activate the anabolic signaling cascades such as the mTOR and the mitogen activated protein kinase pathways, which is what Jared just spoke about earlier.
Another popular mechanism for blood flow restriction training adaptation is the muscle fiber recruitment. What we're finding is that when a hypoxic environment is provided to the muscle, below the low threshold type 1 motor units will readily fatigue because they require oxygen to produce contractions. Therefore, the more glycolytic, the type 2 motor units will be recruited to maintain the same level of force generation.
So the size principle suggests that type 1 fibers are recruited first, with type 2 fibers being recruited with increasing exercise intensities. So we haven't got the intensity, but what we're doing is we're creating a hypoxic condition, and the metabolic accumulation which occurs during the BFR can simulate group 3 and group 4 afferents. Mechanistically speaking, a reflexive net inhibitory effect on the alpha motor neuron may result. Essentially, this facilitates an increase in the fiber recruitment to maintain force and protect against conduction failure.
What that means is while the muscle is exercising, we're producing more of that acid. The acid is being detected by some of our sensory nerves, and that then inhibits our ability to contract the muscle. Therefore, when training with blood flow restriction training, because of that burn, you have to be pushing harder during the exercise, and that causes you to recruit the type 2 muscle fibers.
So while increased motor unit activation is likely to contribute strongly to the enhanced morphological adaptations following BFR training, other factors related to the occlusive stimulus are also likely to play a role. So research actually suggests a low-intensity BFR does not facilitate muscle activation of the same magnitude as higher-intensity resistance exercise without BFR. And we really found that within our own work is that if you want to squat big, you've got to put a lot of load on the bar. There's no way around it out there, listeners.
Thanks, Chris. That's it for episode 15, part 2 of systemic versus localized hypoxia methods. Next week, we'll be looking at practical applications and limitations of BFR, as well as just a quick review of those mechanistic methods. Remember to follow us on Twitter @SnippetScience and visit our website at snippetscience.com.